Thank you, Reagan, for that reading. Like myself, many of my seminary classmates were already engaged in full-time ministry when we were in school. And I remember one particular seminary class where the professor referenced this wonderful story from Acts, acknowledging to us that an 8-hour-long class combined with our busy schedules might prove to be too much. And he said if we felt the need to sleep, we should just please stay away from the windows. I want to be careful in reading this text and sharing this text not to imply to you that falling asleep during a lengthy sermon is necessarily fatal, as long as you have a pew to fall upon, rather than a ground a few stories below. But I also want to encourage you and urge you not to use this particular passage of Scripture to tell me or convince me that sleeping during a sermon is somehow biblical. I had a man who was in my church in Ormond Beach, and it did not fail. Every single Sunday, he fell asleep during my sermon. And finally, I had to come to a point where I just saw my sermons as a ministry to him, as a ministry of rest and a ministry of sleep. But I would suggest that we not do that today, and I will promise not to go on till midnight or even on till dawn, as evidently Paul did in this passage. There is a profound lesson in this story, one we don't talk about very often. How many preachers want to talk about somebody falling asleep during their sermon? But there is a power in this story, a word about the power of presence. We're looking these few weeks at the promises we make when we join the church, when we connect ourselves, when we choose to become a member of this body. I'm grateful for David Gill last week for doing such a beautiful job in starting this series by talking about prayer. We promise, we say, when we join the church, that we will support this church with our prayers and with our presence. And I wonder if you think about very often what you actually promised to do when you stood before this congregation and said, I will support this church with my presence. Well, the obvious answer to this is that we promise to be present at church, to be present physically for worship or for educational opportunities or leadership opportunities that might present themselves to us, to contribute as a member of the body by being here physically. And this is important to be sure. We all know, and we don't have to look very far. In fact, we don't need to look outside our own church to know that church attendance is declining, even among the most faithful. What used to be regular attendance at church 3-4 times a month has now become once every 6 weeks. And that is considered to be regular church attendance. We are faced, quite honestly, with more and more choices with what to do with our time on Sunday morning. And while they say showing up is half the battle, that first half of the battle is sometimes difficult to win. I am old enough to know, and I was reminded this week working with my daughter, just how old I am physically. I'm old enough to remember a time when Sunday was very much a set-apart day. It was a day where stores were closed. Even grocery stores were closed. You didn't do shopping on Sunday. Sunday was a day for church, and it was a day for family. And thank goodness in my family, at least the Dairy Queen was open, because that was part of our Sunday ritual. But if you look around today on a Sunday morning, as our bishop did one day, he said, I deliberately stayed out of worship one Sunday, and I walked around the town and I paid attention to where the people were. And he said a good number of the people were out on the sports fields because their kids were playing baseball and softball and soccer, and those schedules have expanded to Sunday. Our local public schools have athletic rehearsal practices on Sundays. He said, and then I saw another group of people at the home improvement stores. Lowe's and Home Depot will tell you that Sunday mornings are their busiest times of the week. Others are traveling. And there again is a shift in our culture. Again, many of you can remember this, and certainly I do. I don't remember our family traveling a lot when I was growing up. Now, granted, there were 8 of us, and to travel with 8 kids was a little bit of a chore, but I don't remember us taking weekends away. We had 1 week of vacation in the summertime, and that was about it. But we are a much more mobile society. It's nothing to jump in our car and spend the weekend at the beach or to go out of town for another football game. And so we're a traveling group. We travel more for our work. And so sometimes we're just gone. And then let's not overlook this very real, and please hear me, I understand the struggle. When people say to me, do you know Sunday is the only day that I have to myself? I'm working Monday through Friday. Sometimes I'm working on Saturdays, or Saturday is filled with all the home errands, and Sunday is the only day I have for rest, and I choose to rest. Come hear my sermon, I'll put you to sleep, I say. It doesn't work. I say it's biblical. Come. It happened at, no, I'll stay home in my bed. Wait. No, I'm not going to go there. I understand that our world is changing, and the church must make provision for other optional play times for folks to gather and worship. But we can give to our church a great gift when we make the choice to be here. And I understand the commitment, and I acknowledge the commitment, especially those of you with young children. I understand that every Sunday we have a choice. Well, you have a choice, whether to be here or not, and I appreciate the commitment that you make to be in worship. But a less obvious response is when we say that we'll promise our presence at church, is more promising our presence in church. Now, what I mean by this is, it's one thing to be physically present. It's another thing to be spiritually present, to be fully engaged, to be able to focus, to quiet ourselves, to truly listen for the voice of God, to put away our technology. I had somebody who very proudly told me at the door that every week they fact-check my sermon on their phone. I think, wow, that's frightening. Or they say, oh, I looked up that book on Amazon. In fact, I ordered that book on Amazon that you mentioned in your sermon. But all these technological advances serve to keep us disengaged, don't they? I remember the first time the governing board met, and I said, I want you to turn off your phones and put them away for this meeting. We meet together, and we still can't be physically present, or at least mentally present for one another because of the distractions. So I would say this, give to God an extraordinary gift of coming to worship expectant. Come to worship expecting to hear the voice of God, whether it's in the reading of the scripture or the sermon or in the song or in the prayers, or maybe it's in the presence of a loved one. Do you know how good food tastes when you're hungry? Do you know how sweet water tastes when you're really, really thirsty? That's what worship does for our souls. Now, I have a friend of mine who is one of my mentors in ministry. Whenever somebody comes to him and says, you know, I'm just not being fed at this church, his response is this, are you coming hungry? Because if you're not coming hungry, there's no need to be fed. So our presence in church, that willingness to come expectant, that willingness to come with and set our distractions aside, that is a gift that we give to God. And we give it to God because God himself is fully present in worship. God was here before you stepped into the sanctuary. God inhabited this space long before it was actually a sanctuary. God is fully present to us in worship, and we give back to God our own full presence. And we do this because it changes our perspective. Worship has a way of aligning our perspective with God's. A week ago, Monday night, FSU football opened their season with a new head coach, Willie Taggart. It was not the best night. It was not the night we wanted it to be. Even I found myself I got a little bit in me, all right? But even I found myself with that little bit of mercy that God gave me, feeling a little bad. And social media was blowing up Monday night. By the middle of the first quarter, social media was blowing up with condemnation and critique. And then the next morning, someone posted this. They said Bobby Bowden in his first season went 5-6, losing badly to Louisville, Wake Forest, and Boston College. And you could almost collectively hear everyone take a breath and put life in perspective. And that's what worship does for us. See, daily life has a way of shifting our perspective. The stresses of life, family, marriage, career, school, child rearing, personal finances, all these things can loom so large in our life. And when they loom large, God tends to become diminished. Worship has a way of shifting our perspective and reminding us that God is bigger, God is greater, God is more loving than anything we encounter during our week. And it's no wonder in John chapter 3, John the Baptist says of Jesus, "He must increase, but I must decrease." Worship has a way of magnifying Jesus and decreasing our challenges of life, or at least putting them in proper perspective. This passage from Acts where Eutychus falls asleep, falls from the window and is said to be dead, reminds us that in a life that sometimes, quite frankly, is boring. And I sometimes think that is one of our greatest problems in societies. We're simply bored and we're looking for anything else for that next adrenaline rush. This passage reminds us that life has the last word, that love has the last word, that Christ and Christ alone has the last word. And that changes everything for us. Like Eutychus, sometimes we feel like life knocks us down and that we're in a free fall. But worship provides for us that encouragement. The encouragement of others, the encouragement of God. That's what Paul was preaching to this young church. He was about to leave them, and he was trying to fill them with all the wisdom he could before he left. And finally, we consider this, our presence for the church. Have you ever thought about how powerful your presence is? How important you are to this body? If you're having a hard time with that, consider the impact that it has on a child when a parent says, "I'll be at your soccer game," and then fails to show up. That's how it is in the community. When you're not here, the community is somehow less than when members are missing. Now, I want to share something with you that maybe is going to make a lot of you nod your head and say, "Oh yeah, now I get it. Now I understand her." But I thought about this, and I've thought about this much as I've I shouldn't say entered into adulthood, because I haven't done that yet. But as I have grown, I realized that when I was growing up, many of you know I come from a big family, but when I was growing up, presence was not a language of love that we spoke. It's a love language. You know what I'm talking about? We all have love languages. And presence is one of those love languages. In my family, we didn't speak that language. Now, I want to be careful to say this, and I need you to hear this. There was never a moment when I was growing up that I did not feel loved. All right? Please hear that. I grew up feeling loved, feeling secure, knowing my parents cared for me, and they did in countless numbers of ways. But in the family dynamic in which I grew up, presence was not part of our language. And so when I was growing up, when my sisters were growing up, when my brothers were growing up, sports events, music concerts, high school graduations, parents didn't come. They didn't go. And it just was part of who we were, right? We did those things for our own pleasure. I played sports for my own benefit. I played music for my own benefit. And so in my family's philosophy, the reward for that was a job well done. We were blue collar, about as blue collar as you can get in my family, right? The reward for doing it is a job well done. And that language of presence was something that I, as an adult, had to learn, right? I remember it was a revelation to me that a way of showing love was to be there for someone. And so all of my brothers and sisters, I noticed as we raised our own children, we were sure to be there for their concerts and their school plays. And we never let our kids do dance because I just couldn't go to a dance recital. I just couldn't do it. But we were there for our kids, but it was a language that we had to learn. And so as somebody said to me one time, it is not your mother language. That is not your mother tongue. Now, that's okay, but if that's what the language is that people receive, I needed to learn that language, and I'm still learning that language. To go to Kaylee's concerts and to Neil's concerts and to go to Kaylee's school plays said to her, I love you, I care about you. And the same is true as a church. When we're present in the church, what we're saying to each other is, I love you. We say it to God in worship, we say it to each other when we're present for each other. One of the things I love about this church is the stories I hear about how it impacts lives beyond the single generation. I received an email this weekend from somebody, I don't even know these folks, some of you may know them, Jim and Sue McCannell. I think I'm saying that right. They were married in this church 50 years ago this weekend. And their daughter wrote to me, and she said, I personally have never had the pleasure of being in attendance at St. Paul's, but we, the next generation, recognize its special place in our family's legacy. When we're in the area for football games, we still drive by to check it out and have shared the importance of this location with our own children. So now 3 generations know of the importance of this place because Grandma and Grandpa got married here 50 years ago this weekend. She said, please, would you add Jim and Sue to your prayers to celebrate their dedication to their faith and their union of 50 years, to continue with the strength and vigor and laughter as it has done all these years. I sent a note to Jim and Sue, wrote it this morning, to congratulate them on their anniversary and to thank them for reminding me just how important community is, even when we're not here. See, it's the community of the church that encourages us. It's the community of the church that affirmed my call to ministry, that held me and Kaylee tenderly after Neil's death. It's the community of the church that builds wheelchair ramps and cooks meals and cleans houses and visits the hospital and celebrates new babies. It's the church that mentors children in math and reading, that gives our young mothers a chance to gather together for support and adult conversation. It's the church that provides support for groups for those who are grieving or for those who are struggling with addiction. It's the United Methodist Church through UMCOR that is present in natural disasters and promises to remain present until all the work is done. It's the United Methodist Church that is present in social activism, providing sanctuary and safety for those who may not be safe due to violence or hatred. It's the United Methodist Church that provides a voice for those who have no voice or who at one point did but lost their voice. It's often after a season of great need in an individual life or in the life of a community when you hear the remark, "I can't even imagine doing this without the support of my church." And my guess is that there are countless numbers of stories sitting right here that can talk life into those words. It's why my heart is breaking over talk of the United Methodist Church breaking up over the issue of human sexuality. Because I feel like while we may not agree, and I'm not naive enough to think that we're all going to agree, I think one of the most powerful witnesses we can offer to the world as a church is how do we stay together even when we don't agree? How do we stay at the table and love one another even when we don't see everything eye to eye? I think that's the witness we can give to our world, a world that sees division and schism as sort of a default mechanism that simply says, if you don't agree with me, I won't associate with you anymore. We as the United Methodist Church have a chance to turn that around, and I pray and I invite you to pray that we'll continue to remain unified. Being part of the church is a choice that you make. It is a promise you made when you stood and took membership vows, but it is a choice you make like every other promise every single day to be faithful. And it speaks volumes when you keep your promise. Because presence is a language of love. Today, you chose to honor God with your presence. You chose to honor the person sitting next to you with your presence. The person sitting in front of you, the person sitting behind you with your presence. And I believe with all that I am that God rewards that choice by being fully present to us, strengthening us, encouraging us, healing us, mending the broken places in our lives. That's the power of presence and the power of our promise. I want to share with you a brief poem that I shared at the early service before communion, written by a friend of mine named Jan Richardson. It's about the power of presence, and she writes, "Take my hand, and you will see how this blessing finds its way to us. Not as if we each held a piece of its puzzle, but as if it cannot resist the space that opens between us, this place that is made where two meet, where three touch, where we gather, with our eyes open, with our hearts open, with our hands open, open to one another, and on our lips, the name of love, all the blessing we need to ever know." Amen.